Hello, Archie Dunlop here with Talking Astrology with Archie. And in this video, I'm going to be looking at the weekend of July the 5th and 6th, 2025. Now, one thing that is happening this weekend is that Neptune is stationary retrograde. So from the Earth's perspective, it comes to a standstill. And that is something that a lot of people get excited about. And so I will be discussing what it means for Neptune to be stationary retrograde, and of course over the next few months it will be moving backwards, and although Neptune is in Aries right now, it does actually move back into Pisces. Additionally, we've just had Venus moving into Gemini, and I do want to just briefly look at what it means for Venus to be in Gemini, and also to look at some example charts of people who have this placement. But first of all, I want to look at the astrology and the I Ching for the weekend. So here is the chart of the weekend, set for midnight on Sunday the 6th, New York time. Don't forget, by the way, to like and subscribe if appropriate. And so the weekend has the moon in Scorpio at midnight on Sunday. Moon is actually at 20 degrees 59 Scorpio, New York time. And that means that over the course of Saturday, the moon is starting to move out of the Via Combustor, and the moon starts Saturday making a sextile to Mars, and it makes a trine to the sun. And yeah, you could say that when the moon leaves the Via Combustor, that things might calm down. Things are maybe more predictable. Although there are other things going on we do need to consider. And for example, we have got the Sun making a semisquare to Uranus. So the Sun at midnight on Sunday is at 14:22 Cancer, New York time. So the Sun is moving towards a semisquare with Uranus, just as Uranus is about to change sign, move into Gemini. On Sunday, Sun semisquare Uranus, and this happens quite close to a sesquiquadrate between the Moon and the Sun. So I'm thinking that Sunday is possibly going to be a more active day than Saturday, not necessarily in a good way. I mean, that Sun semisquare Uranus could relate to happenings. So, we just got out of the moon in the Via Combustor, then we got Sun semisquare Uranus, and so Uranus does become quite prominent over the weekend. And yeah, things might happen, but it might also say something about what's happening in the world. And yeah, I'll be looking at that complex between the Sun and the Moon and Uranus. Well, am I going to look at it? In fact, I'm going to look at it now. So here's the Sun. Here's the Sun semisquare Uranus that we have on Sunday, late on Sunday. So you can see, there is the Sun at 0 degree. This is right at the end of Sunday, by the way, just as Sunday is turning into Monday. And so there's a Sun at 15 degrees Cancer, just 15 degrees 5 Cancer. There's a Moon at 0 degrees 6 Sagittarius. I mean, although one is 5 minutes, the other is 6 minutes, this is when the sesquiquadrate is exact. And so, that is the time when the moon moves into Sagittarius. So late on Sunday, that would be, I think that's 11:06 p.m. London time, which is going to be sort of late afternoon, early evening in the Americas, more late afternoon. And the moon moves into Sagittarius. So if you're in the Americas, there is a bit of moon in Sagittarius, at the end of a weekend. Now, the thing is about this Sun-Moon sesquiquadrate, well, it's the last hard aspect before the full moon, because don't forget we've got a full moon coming up. That full moon is going to be on July the 10th. So next week we've got that. That's at 1850 Capricorn. So that this sesquiquadrate does link up with Uranus, because the moon is opposition Uranus and the sun is semisquare Uranus. So that's quite a powerful aspect. And so we might not feel this aspect until right at the end of a weekend, perhaps even into Monday. But it is something that we need to be aware of, and probably Sunday moving into Monday, some of us might have to be careful. Now, aside from that, we do have Jupiter making a decile to Uranus. Decile, remember, that is a 30-degree aspect. So there is Jupiter in Uranus. You can see the decile, and decile might be about freedom. Jupiter-Uranus as a pair is about freedom, wanting to reach out for something beyond us, to get rid of the chains. And so how do we do this? It's not automatic, it's not immediate. That we can see all the things that are in our way, but we do have the willpower. We really think that this can be done. And so if we do believe we can be free, well, maybe we can be free, but it might need some planning. This is a decile. This is the struggle to make something happen. So if you are feeling constrained over the weekend, think about what needs to be done to break free. And additionally, Sunday we've got Venus sextile Saturn, Venus sextile Neptune. So obviously these aspects happen very close together because Saturn and Neptune are pretty much making a conjunction at the moment. I mean, there's Saturn and Neptune are they're 10, 16 degrees apart. The conjunction doesn't actually become exact because they do go retrograde. Saturn is about to go retrograde. Saturn will slow down and will in the end start moving away from Neptune. But we are getting a Saturn-Neptune feel here. This could be worries, just being worried about stuff. But Venus sextile Saturn, Venus sextile Neptune, I'd be more interested perhaps in Venus sextile Saturn. I think that is an aspect that is more sort of directly available. And with Venus sextile Saturn, that is a good aspect for sort of, organizing things, bringing things down to earth, bringing a vision down to earth. It could be about bringing a relationship down to earth. But there is that tension between Venus sextile Saturn, Venus sextile Neptune. We want stability, but also we want something else. Venus is in Gemini. Venus in Gemini can get bored of people. Can get bored of particular relationships which have just perhaps gone on for too long. And Venus in Gemini can actually be quite disruptive and can be quite independent. And that theme of Venus and Gemini and independence is something I'll be looking at sort of later in the video. There seems to be a potential theme there. And so do make the most of that. And perhaps you can ask yourself, what you want, what kind of relationships you want, what kind of aesthetics you want. Venus is a planet of beauty. Venus sextile Neptune is quite an imaginative aspect, particularly with Venus and Gemini. And so if we have something that we are imagining, maybe we can bring it down to earth. So those are a few of the aspects coming together. It's a relatively busy weekend. There is a lot going on, quite a lot to talk about, and it's difficult to know what to prioritize. And as far as the picture in Sydney, Australia is concerned, at midnight on Sunday, the moon is earlier in Scorpio. It's at 14 degrees 14 degrees to Scorpio. Not a great deal of difference between the Americas and Australia and New Zealand. Throughout Saturday, if you're in Australasia and East Asia, the moon will be moving through the first half of Scorpio. The moon will be in Novia Combusta. So it's always a difficult part of the sign Scorpio. And so you can't expect everything to happen exactly as planned. But, as I was saying to those of you in the Americas, as soon as the moon leaves the Via Combusta, the sun starts making a semisquare to Uranus. So it might be a question of, out of the frying pan into the fire. And then there is the heliocentric view, putting the sun at the center of the solar system, where arguably it should be. And I was talking about Friday, and heliocentrically I was saying, well, there's a sun, it was semisquare. Sun was square Mars. Sorry, Earth was square Mars, and Earth was making a sesquiquadrate to Uranus, and Mars was starting to make a sesquiquadrate to Uranus. Well, that aspect is not quite as strong. The Earth now really is moving away from that square to Mars, so maybe it's losing some of its intensity, although Mars is getting closer to the sesquiquadrate with Uranus at a time when we have got at a time when we've got we've got Mars making a sesquiquadrate to Uranus at a time when we have got the Sun making a semisquare to Uranus geocentrically. So there's still a bit of tension in the air. Mercury is making a trine to Saturn. So heliocentrically, we've got Mercury at around sort of 24 Scorpio, making a trine to Saturn at 25, 26 Pisces. And so by the end of the weekend, that trine should be close to exact, and that's a fairly straightforward aspect, though we shouldn't forget that Mercury is starting to make an opposition to Uranus, and so Mercury opposition Uranus, trine Saturn, Mercury opposition Uranus, trine Saturn, yeah, that's right. It may represent, on one hand, our desire to be different, our desire to say things which are different, to get attention, but on the other hand, we're trying to create a lasting impression, and we do have to think about how well our words are going to last. So if we say something, we want to make sure that we have a lasting impact. So perhaps we should be choosing our words carefully. And now it's time to look at the 12 signs. So these are my forecasts for the 12 signs for the weekend of July the 5th and 6th, 2025. Aries, things continue to be, ever so slightly complicated. Nothing is entirely straightforward, and you're perhaps just picking up on what is going on around you. It's not that you are an especially complicated person. You're not. Aries, in fact, is one of the most straightforward signs of the zodiac. You could say the most straightforward sign of the zodiac. It is the pioneer, the initiator. Complications should not stand in the way of your ability to take the initiative. But right now, with the moon in Scorpio, it may be difficult for you to really fire on all cylinders. And if you want to get anything done, you may have to do things in a somewhat roundabout way. And in fact, you might not be especially motivated to, stand up, be counted, be noticed. That might not be what you want to do. And, as far as you're concerned, there are other things of interest, and they don't have to be advertised. and you just quietly get on with it in your own way, and that should be fine. And Aries, don't forget your own fundamental spirituality. There is a spiritual feel over the weekend if you're an Aries. Part of you does like the possibility of being part of something which is just beyond yourself, and you might be thinking about some of your usual travails, your usual concerns, your usual worries, and there may be moments where you're asking yourself, well, what is the point? Wouldn't it be better to just become part of something else, to be able to just not necessarily have to be an individual all the time? It's a lot of pressure being an individual, being an Aries. People are looking on you to take the lead, to take the initiative, but that can be hard work, and it might be a time where you just want to do nothing and just see where the universe wants to take you. And if it's not the universe, maybe you can get some solace from other people. I mean, Venus has just moved into Gemini, and so Venus moving into Gemini might mean that certain people are becoming more interesting and more active. Gemini is a positive sign. It's always got ideas. May not be able to actually see those ideas through, but still, it tries its hardest. And so, with Venus making a sextile to Saturn, sextile to Neptune, that could say something about how other people are behaving, and perhaps they've got ideas and they're ready to half take initiatives. They're not necessarily able to see it all the way, and maybe Aries, you can help. So it's not that you're called upon to be a complete leader, where it's you having to come up with the ideas, come up with the action. Maybe you can just come up with some of the action, and perhaps another person can provide a lot of support, or is it you providing the support? So don't dismiss other people. They could be interesting, and they could sort of point the way to sort of new adventures. But are you really in the mood for adventures? You're in the mood for gentle adventures which don't require a huge amount of effort. And looking at the weekend overall, Aries, it might just be a weekend where you don't necessarily want to do anything at all. And if you can dissolve into something beyond yourself, and be thinking about things, the kind of things that might potentially last forever, aren't just ephemeral things. They appear one day, they disappear the next, and perhaps it's all about letting go. You don't have to completely let go. You're an Aries. You're always going to have a degree of control. You're not going to lose your ability to take the initiative. But sometimes it can be a relief to be able to just take the back seat and let someone else, or if it's not someone else, some other entity, some consciousness, some collective spirit, whatever it is, move things forward for you. Taurus, Venus has been in Gemini for a bit of time. I mean, the weekend starts with Venus moving into Gemini, but still, Venus in Gemini is, one of my sort of headline astrological features, and I will be talking about Venus in Gemini in some detail later in the video. But this weekend you are feeling this sign placement, and it does say a lot about you and how you are changing. You have had Venus in Taurus for some time, and Venus was in its own sign in Taurus, which is was certainly something fortunate, because Venus does work very well in this sign. Venus rules Taurus, but anyway, now it's in Gemini, and it could be, Taurus, that you are becoming more flexible. You can see other possibilities. You don't necessarily feel that you're absolutely committed to one course of action. Maybe there are several courses of action to consider. But Venus is making a sextile to Saturn and sextile to Neptune. Well, Venus sextile Saturn does indicate that you do have a degree of discipline. There is some self-control there, and you do know what is important, and it's not just a relaxing weekend. You know that you've got to think about material details. Maybe there's financial stuff you have to think about. If you have any ideas about money, then with Venus sextile Saturn, it might be a time to sort of define them. What actually do you mean? What would you have to do to achieve some of your financial targets? Yet Venus is also making a sextile to Neptune, and Venus sextile Neptune is not a particularly material aspect, or at least it shouldn't be. Venus sextile Neptune can be very imaginative. Do give your imagination, free flow. Perhaps Taurus, recently there have been times where you have deliberately limited your imagination. You've perhaps had some ideas, but you just thought they were just too far-fetched, too dangerous. You couldn't be bothered with them. You didn't want to deal with the unknown. And now with Venus and Gemini sextile Neptune, you may be starting to see the possibilities, and maybe you can take a possibility, even a fantasy, and turn it into something real. And that might be a way of working with the Saturn-Neptune energy, because Saturn and Neptune are starting to form a conjunction. And this Saturn-Neptune conjunction, it doesn't actually become exact, but they're getting very close to one another. And so with Venus making this sextile to Saturn and Neptune, it's perhaps taking your fear, or maybe another person's fear, or other people's fear, and doing something with it, being constructive about it. It could be, Taurus, that where there is fear, there is an opportunity for you. So do think about that. And Venus is in Gemini, so Venus perhaps has the flexibility to deal with the concept of fear and opportunity, and how you can actually understand the fears around you and cut a path through them. And while all this is going on, the moon is moving through Scorpio, and moon moving through Scorpio is your opposite sign. And so when the moon is in Scorpio, this is a time when you often have an awareness of what is going on in other people's minds, and you're perhaps more sensitive than usual. And on Saturday, the moon is making a sextile to Mars and a trine to Sun, a bit of a Sun. It's a very fortunate aspect, moon trine Sun, and moon in Scorpio, trine Sun in Cancer. It's a very sensitive aspect, and it perhaps allows you to communicate. I mean, you can communicate at the moment. Venus is in Gemini, your ruler is in Gemini. Gemini is a sign connected with communication, and also the moon is trine the Sun. So, if there's something you want to say, even if it's quite a delicate matter, I think you'll be able to say those words, and to say those words with subtlety and enough consideration to not cause any upset. So overall, Taurus, it looks like being quite a constructive weekend when you start to realize that Venus has changed, you have changed, and that you're better able to deal with variety. Gemini, this weekend, Venus is very much in your sign. It might be at the beginning of your sign, but it's still there, and so you can enjoy Venus's fortunate energy. I think it is fortunate. I mean, Venus is a benefic. it works well, and it helps you. It helps you express yourself. It gives you confidence, and it makes you see possibilities. Possibilities that might be represented by other people, and because you know how to present yourself, and you know how to in many ways get the most out of others. So it's important not to be shy, although you might still have your reservations. The moon is in Scorpio, and it's always a bit of a problem when the moon is in Scorpio if you're a Gemini, because it's an alien energy, really. And moon in Scorpio is asking you to use your feelings, and also to be quite methodical. And Geminis sometimes are not methodical. I might be fairly methodical when it comes to astrology, but when it comes to anything else, I'm not methodical at all. Things can just go all over the place. And the challenge of moon in Scorpio in a fixed sign, is to get things together. And reluctantly, Gemini, you can get things together. You might not want to. You might want to do something else. But the moon on Saturday is making a trine to the sun. That moon trine sun, Gemini, can help you in very practical ways. So if there's something you haven't wanted to bother with, perhaps it's something to do with where things are placed, with things that you've lost for ages and you want to find them again, or it could be about money. That moon trine sun might allow you to organize yourself and get yourself together. But you needn't worry about it too much. And when it comes to relationships and other people in general, I think that Gemini, you are pretty dynamic, and you can express yourself, who you are, what you've got to offer, and many people are just going to like you. You are likable, and you should be happy about that. And if you find that you're getting favourable attention from another person, see where it goes, and don't allow people to slip through your fingers. It's tempting to just talk to one person, talk to another person, and not form any sort of lasting bonds. But if you want to create lasting bonds, I think you can. Venus in Gemini is making a sextile to Saturn, and that could be about other people. I mean, I'm not necessarily talking about close relationships. It's just if you meet people over the weekend and you like their company, then perhaps they've got something to offer in the future. So Venus sextile Saturn might be formalizing a contact or a relationship, and putting it on a secure footing and making it potentially part of a future. So other people have their roles to play, and I think you can present yourself pretty well. And additionally, your reluctant sense of detail, as I said, Geminis are not real details people usually, but your reluctant sense of detail can help you further, can help you to really stabilize things. Cancer, it's a weekend where you can be yourself, particularly on Saturday. I mean, Saturday seems quite an active time for you. The moon is making a sextile to Mars. It's making a trine to the sun. That moon trine sun on Saturday, and it moves through until Sunday, but Saturday is when that moon trine sun is at sort of maximum impact. It's a great aspect. And you've got the moon in Scorpio, you've got the sun in Cancer, and so you're at home, you're just at one with yourself, things are flowing. And if you want to do something fun, I think you very much can. And so try to enjoy yourself on Saturday. Try not to make things too complicated for yourself. And if there's something you want to do, just make sure you do it. And you can do it with enthusiasm and power, and also you don't need anyone's help. I mean, if people are around, that's great. If people want to join in, also that's great, but it's all pretty optional. And so on Saturday, I think that you do have a high degree of freedom. On Sunday, things might be getting a little more complicated. One aspect we've got on Sunday is a semisquare between the Sun and Uranus. That might have an effect on you because the Sun is moving through Cancer. It's making a semisquare to Uranus, and also the Moon is making a sesquiquadrate to the Sun. At the end of the weekend. So especially as Sunday moves to Monday, then you perhaps realize that things aren't quite so simple, and you might give something your second thought. You think maybe it's another person's behavior, and it occurs to you, why is someone doing what they're doing? And it might have been a feeling that's been building up for some time, especially if you're dealing with someone you've known for a very long time. Uranus has been moving through Taurus for something like 7 years, 6-7 years, for a long time. And Uranus is on the verge of moving into Gemini. And Uranus, I don't know how you felt about Uranus moving through Taurus, but it could have shaken up some of your friendships. Who do you know? Do you still know them? And if you still know someone, how have they changed? And with the Sun semisquare Uranus, it might sort of occur to you that some people really have changed. And the question is that a good thing? And what are the implications? That's an important issue for Cancerians, because Cancerians, as a sign, probably one of the loyalist of the 12 signs. Loyalty is really important to Cancerians, and issues of loyalty and betrayal. If someone betrays a Cancer, they will never get forgiven. And so you may be looking at what people are doing, and perhaps it occurs to you that someone has been disloyal, and you're asking yourself, hold on, is this the kind of person you want to really associate with? So you might be having these sort of deeper questions, over the weekend, and especially on Sunday. But of course, Sunday is just one day, and I do these daily horoscopes, and inevitably there's always going to be hyperbole and exaggeration in what I say. It's kind of goes with the territory, because I'm trying to make forecasts for the signs for every day, and sometimes things just don't happen, but I have to look for things to happen. And if anything could happen, it might just be that another person's actions, or even if actions aren't today, if they happen, maybe they could have happened years ago, but now it's beginning to hit home, just as Uranus is about to move into Gemini. But aside from these complicated issues, in terms of what you're actually doing over the weekend, especially on Saturday, I think that you do have a great deal of freedom, and if you want to do something, you can just go and do it, and there shouldn't be a great deal of pressure on you. Leo, right now you're in a position where you can have an impact. You really can. If you don't like something, you can change it. If you feel that something needs to be improved upon, then for sure you can create those improvements, and you may be able to do it in quite a dramatic way, because you're quite impatient right now, and your impatience might not be obvious. People might assume that you're just quietly doing your own thing. You're not making a noise. It almost seems that you want to be ignored, and all the while things are happening. And if you have a vision, if you have an idea that you'd like to move forward with something, Leo, then I really think you can. And so it does matter that you give yourself that chance. And it can come from nowhere. And as the weekend gets underway, many Leos may feel quite tense, and the reason is that the Sun, which is your ruler, is moving towards a semisquare of Uranus. So what's happening is that the Sun is moving towards 15 degrees Cancer, right in the middle of Cancer, and right in the middle of Cancer, it makes a semisquare to Uranus, which, remember, Uranus is about to change sign. It's about to move from Taurus to Gemini. So it could feel, Leo, that really something has to give, that it's just not good enough the way it is, and it's important that you're able to make things happen. Because if you feel tense and you don't do anything, then the problem is, the basic problem is that you could just feel tense, and no one wants to feel tense. But it's also that you might be encouraging things to happen from the outside, so you're not in full control. So if you want something to happen, then make it happen, and you be the one who is dynamic. Because if you're not dynamic and you want to be dynamic, then the dynamism may come from elsewhere, and that's not a particularly useful situation. It could be quite unsettling, actually, and you might indeed be losing control. And that's the last thing you want to happen with Sun semisquare Uranus. Sun semisquare Uranus can go two ways. It can be about you being Uranus, you being the one that is making things happen, or it's about you being at the receiving end, and you don't want to be at the receiving end. So make sure, Leo, that you are as assertive as possible. And if something needs to be said, if something needs to be done, then I think you can make it happen. And this is especially the case on Saturday, because on Saturday we have a trine between the Moon and the Sun, and this Moon trine Sun it's quite an understated aspect. It's not an aspect that is going to be right in your face, but it's there. And if you use this aspect in your own quiet way, Moon in Scorpio trine the Sun in Gemini, you know what you trust. You know that you're secure, and you can use that security as a base for perhaps moving into new territory or exploring new ideas. And you don't have to advertise the fact. It's all very quiet, but something is happening, and you might have moments of harmony on a Saturday where things really come together, and that's the realization. And having got this realization, then the question is, what do you do about it? And that at that stage, you might feel that you can afford to be more dramatic and more outwardly creative. Virgo, we have a kind of a return to some Gemini. We thought that the Gemini season was well and truly over, but Venus is slipping into Gemini. Well, Venus is in Gemini, and sure, that's important if you're a Gemini, but it's also important if you're a Virgo. And the reason Venus moving into Gemini is important for a Virgo is because Gemini is a sign that matters to you. It's a sign that is ruled by Mercury. Virgo is also ruled by Mercury. So Mercury binds those two signs between Gemini and Virgo. Yeah, they're very different signs. Virgo's an earth sign, Gemini's an air sign, but they are linked. They both have a mutability and a flexibility to them. And with Venus moving into Gemini, you may be thinking about possibilities, and you may also be starting to think about what is missing. Jupiter has left Gemini, and of course Jupiter won't be back in Gemini for another 11 years, but Venus moving into Gemini may remind you of what you haven't done. Perhaps some of your ambitions, some things you were trying to achieve and didn't achieve, but maybe there's one last chance. So if you missed something with Jupiter moving into Gemini, maybe with Venus moving into Gemini, there is another chance. So what is it? So see what you can do, and don't doubt yourself. And of course, Uranus is about to move into Gemini, and now Uranus moving into Gemini, that is a big deal, because that stays in Gemini. Okay, it does briefly go back into Taurus because of retrograde motion, but by and large, it stays in Gemini for a long time, for years and years. And so you are definitely getting another chance. And with Venus in Gemini, think about how great you are on all levels. And there may even just be a sheer physicality to that. Venus in Gemini for you, it can be an aspect relating to looking in mirrors. I mean, not necessarily literally looking at mirrors, but looking at yourself, what kind of impression you have, what you're wearing, what kind of impact you're having. Yeah, it can literally be what you look like. And there is a certain vanity to Venus moving into Gemini. Now, I don't mean vanity necessarily in a negative way. There's nothing wrong with vanity. I mean, vanity is completely human. All humans are, to some extent, vain. And so caring about what you look like, and perhaps even thinking that you look good, there's nothing wrong with that. And that's something you can do with Venus in Gemini. It is the the Snow White stepmother kind of thing. Mirror, mirror, mirror on the wall. Who is the most beautiful of them all? And maybe it's Virgo. Maybe it really is. And that's how you should regard yourself, because if you have a high self-esteem, that means you can make things happen. And so use Venus moving into Gemini. Maybe the weekend is the start of things for you, and you can start to think about what you need, who you need. And Virgo, I do think that you're socially going to be very effective, and if you're in a situation where you can meet people, I think you can come over as being someone who is quite powerful and dynamic, and you also have a lot to say for yourself. Especially on Saturday when the moon is making a trine to the sun. So Virgo, it's important that you don't ask yourself too many questions, or reach the conclusion that you're not special, because you really are special, and it's very important that you regard yourself as being special, because I think it is a time, certainly over the next few weeks, when you can really start to make an impression. And if you've got ambitions which you feel you've sort of neglected and have fallen by the wayside, now is a great time to go back, pick them up, and get the show back on the road. Libra, I have already talked about Venus in Gemini, but this weekend is perhaps just a reminder that Venus, your ruler, is has changed sign, and in Gemini, it's just so different from how it was in Taurus. In Taurus, you do feel that you're an active player. You should feel yourself to be an active player, and you need to tell yourself that you can make things happen, even against the odds, and you're able to influence a much larger chunk of humanity than you had possibly imagined. Librans, remember, Libra is a sign that crops up quite a lot when we're thinking about politicians, for example. Think about all the Libran politicians. Not just in the past, but in the present. Vladimir Putin. You've got him. You've got AOC. You've got that guy in New York who's just won the Democrat primaries. You've had Margaret Thatcher. And I'm not telling you to be a politician, but I am telling you that in your own way you can have an influence, and just because you have a private vision doesn't mean that it's just your fantasy. It needn't be your fantasy. It can be real. And so if something's not right, Libra, then be open about it, and have a vision to think about what might be possible. And you're going to be helped by two sextiles actually, between Venus and Saturn and Venus and Neptune. Venus sextile Saturn is about potentially bringing something down to earth, perhaps even bringing people down to earth. So, what are people for? Now, Libra at some level is a manipulative sign, and Libra can see humans as being material for you to get things done, to achieve whatever your will might be. So I'm saying that you don't have to see Libra as being a weak sign. It can actually be the opposite. And so with Venus sextile Saturn, you should be asking yourself, how can people help you? You have a vision, you have something you want to achieve, and you can be helped. And it might mean that you have to do some listening, and you might have to change your strategy. Some people might be very clear about how things should and shouldn't be done. You can listen. You don't have to accept everything that you're told, but it's all about dealing with people and everything they've got to offer. And one thing they might have to offer, is structure. Now, Venus is not just making a sextile to Saturn; it's making a sextile to Neptune, and that does give us a very different feel. So Venus sextile Neptune, you might say, is actually quite a spiritual aspect. Neptune is about being part of something bigger than yourself. And Neptune is especially strong, or at least prominent this weekend, because it's coming to a standstill from the Earth's perspective. It is stationary retrograde. And so with Venus making a sextile to a stationary Neptune, then you might see something, you might be excited about something, and you might see a new possibility. And also, Libra, if you have any artistic or creative ability, particularly the artistic ability, then that Venus sextile Neptune may allow you to explore it. And so it could be a great weekend for writing, painting, creating, and it might even be that the conjunction between Saturn and Neptune, they work together to facilitate things. So you might say that Venus sextile Neptune is your imagination, and Venus sextile Saturn is about you taking this imagination, bringing it down to earth, and making it real. And it can be a real weekend, and it can also be a weekend where you just are able to make your mark, and you're able to show yourself at the very least that you're able to improve things. And it's not just about your imagination. It's also about the real world, and you can you can not just make an impression, but in the end you can be rewarded. So overall, Libra, I would have said it looks like being a pretty good weekend. Scorpio. Scorpio, we still have the moon in your sign, and so with the moon moving through your sign, making a trine to the sun on Saturday, and also making a sextile to Mars. Saturday looks an especially good day when you're able to move around and make an impact, and you understand a score. You know what you can get away with, and there could just be something very, very natural about you. Natural, but also assertive. With the moon making those two aspects to the sun and Mars, and so if there are things that you feel you need to get hold of them, then probably you should focus your energies on the Saturday rather than on the Sunday, and maybe even sort of early on Saturday. So don't spend all the Saturday in bed doing nothing. Well, if you are ambitious, if there are things you need to get hold of, whatever they might be. So that's Saturday. As you move into Sunday, things could change, and certainly if you're an American Sagittarius, an American Scorpio, then on Sunday, towards the end of Sunday, the moon does change sign. The moon moves out of Scorpio and it moves into Sagittarius. So, moon moving into Sagittarius, well, the Scorpio feel is over, and you might not have quite so much power, and at least not quite so much spontaneity, but at the same time you may be able to get some perspective on the last couple of days and be able to think, well, what do you need to get hold of in order to see things through? So that might be a question for you. And additionally, by the end of the weekend, we do have a semisquare between the Sun and Uranus, and that Sun semisquare Uranus could stir things up, and you perhaps should be thinking about what you're trying to sort out, what you are trying to achieve. And with Sun semisquare Uranus, there might be something else you have to take into account, something you've not been taking into account, and you'd perhaps taken it for granted, and you'd maybe assumed that certain people, certain situations would run smoothly, run to plan, and as Saturday moves to Sunday, you might have second thoughts, and you might think, well, this is not necessarily the case, and there is something that needs to be dealt with that is perhaps more complicated than you'd realize. So that's one way in which a Sun semisquare Uranus might work. But different Scorpios have different priorities, and one could argue that this weekend you actually just want to let go. You don't want to have any ambitions at all. I mean, you need your ambitions, but this weekend you perhaps have a vision of something much larger than yourself, and it's a very, very positive vision, and it's difficult to put into words, and it represents you as being part of something much bigger than yourself, and in the process being a lot more powerful. And perhaps it is a realization that on your own there are limits to what you can achieve, and that might be something spiritual, but it might be to do with your hopes for society and humanity. And so be prepared to see the whole, because the cosmos is allowing you to see the whole. Of course, that means you need to take a different path. That means you need to sort of put short-term ambitions and concerns to one side and get that broader perspective. Not every Scorpio is going to want to go down that path, but I think that is certainly an option for you. And finally, there is, relationships. If you want to be bothered with relationships, then things mightn't be so bad. Venus, the planet of relationships, is sextile Saturn, sextile Neptune. And Venus sextile Saturn is about responsibility. That's one way of looking at the aspect. And it might be that certain people are able to come up with the goods, and they're able to conform to an extent. You don't want people to be complete conformists, but they're not necessarily going to do anything too crazy. And with Venus sextile Neptune, it's you have to kind of merge Saturn and Neptune together. So people have ideas and they have a sensitivity, but it's not a crazy sensitivity. And so perhaps if you want to get close to someone at an emotional and spiritual level, with Venus making a sextile to Saturn and Neptune, I think perhaps you can. Sagittarius. Sagittarius, you perhaps are not entirely happy with the way things are going. And I mean that not in a negative sense. It's good to be discontented because it means there's a possibility of progress and you are motivated. And so you might be of a view that you are restricted, that you can't do everything you want, but you can just see the possibility. You can see that if you were allowed to do whatever you wanted, then the sky would be the limit. And so that's a good place to be. But what you don't want to do, Sagittarius, is tell yourself that the reason you can't do anything is because you're being blocked by external forces, whether it's people or organizations, whatever, because that's not true. If there is any blockage, any real blockage, it's probably largely down to you. Or let me rephrase that. Let me put that in a positive sense. You have an idea, you have things you want to do, and you have the ability to use your mind and your willpower to actually make it happen. And perhaps you're not doing it. You're thinking it's just not worth the effort. And so if you do put in the effort, Sagittarius, you decide that you really do feel that you want to change something and you want to break free. There must be one thing. I'm not saying it must be one thing. There's perhaps one thing you feel you want to get away from, and it's all in your mind. And if you're able to create the energy and the momentum, and when I say momentum, it's that inner momentum, it's where everything in you comes together, is brought together, then it might be quite a lot of effort, but you can do it. So Sagittarius, don't hold back and understand that you really are, I think, strongly placed. And furthermore, Sagittarius, this is a time when you have this wonderful ability to really communicate and tell people what you're all about. Some people don't know what you're all about. They're guessing, they're making assumptions, and perhaps you need to tell them, what are you working on at the moment? What have you got that no one else has? And now just could be the time for, not necessarily telling everyone, but some people need to know. And you don't necessarily have to deliver messages, make press statements. It can actually be be just in terms of who you are and what you're presenting, because just by being yourself, doing what you enjoy, or even just trying to do what you enjoy, then it all becomes clear. And so that makes you actually quite a powerful figure. And so as far as relationships are concerned, things do seem to be working, or at least they could be working, because it's quite obvious, Sagittarius. So right now you have a lot to offer, and you are a dynamic, exciting person, and you have your own struggles, but you are struggling to find your freedom, and people pick up on that struggle, and they don't regard it, I don't think, as a bad thing. They see you as exciting and interesting, and it's as if you're just ready to make things happen. And then right at the end of a weekend, we got the moon moving into Sagittarius, which is great, isn't it? Because the moon is moving into your sign, and so when it moves into your sign, it makes a sextile to Pluto, and arguably that sets you up very nicely for next week. Capricorn, we have the moon continuing its progress through Scorpio, and on Saturday the moon makes a very pleasant trine to the sun, and so the sun is in Cancer, your opposite sign, moon making a trine to it, so that does allow you to get on well with people. So whatever you're doing on Saturday, any form of social interaction, should actually be pretty effective. Not necessarily in a dramatic way, but you know how to behave, how to get people onto your side, and also you're able to keep things moving. That can be important. And so if anyone is feeling stuck, they're not sure what to do, you can sort of exercise this gentle pressure, which creates a stream of sort of action, maybe low-level action, but it does really feel that it does feel that there is progress. And with this moon trine sun on Saturday, moon also makes a sextile to Mars. That by and large means that your contacts with other people should run well, and any relationship you're in shouldn't be too much of a problem. And then continuing on the theme of relationships, Venus has just gone into Gemini, and Venus is now making a sextile to Saturn. So Venus sextile Saturn could be another person, someone who can be useful. You needn't be in a close relationship with them for them to be useful, and they might just appear. They might be the right person for the right task. So if you're trying to do something and you're finding it not 100% easy, you might just find that there's someone there who's prepared to help you, and it all sort of comes together. And that Venus sextile Saturn could be about work. If you're working over the weekend, I think that Venus sextile Saturn does indicate that you can really get things together, and you can possibly get things together with another person's help. But even if there is no one to help you, then you can really get a lot done. So not exciting, but certainly useful, and it's so that perhaps is the picture for the weekend. No fireworks, of course. Hopefully, if you're in the United States, people have already used up their fireworks on Friday, but no fireworks, or not as many fireworks as on Friday. And at the same time, gentle progress, and additionally, getting help in ways which I'm not going to say surprising, because I don't think it's an especially surprising weekend, but people are able to come up with the goods. The right people are able to come up with the goods. So so in the end, this weekend, it does look solid. Aquarius. If you have anything important to do, then maybe you should do it on Saturday rather than Sunday. I think that Saturday is possibly a more straightforward day, and the moon in Scorpio is making a trine to the sun, and this allows things to progress smoothly. And so if you are working on something and it's important to you, then it should really go to plan, and you'll be able to bring to bear your sort of inner emotional resources. And so whatever it is you're trying to achieve, then on Saturday, I think that you can make excellent progress. And if something happens that you weren't expecting, then probably you'll just be able to take it in your stride, or even more so, it's possible that you just might be able to actually take advantage of something you hadn't planned for. It crops up, and you can kind of integrate it into whatever it is that you might be doing. And as you move into Sunday, possibly things get more complicated, and it may be difficult to make clear plans. Things might come up, and perhaps other people can't be entirely relied on. One aspect that takes place this weekend, on Sunday, is a semisquare between the Sun and Uranus. So the Sun and Uranus does say something about other people. The Sun is the ruler of Leo, which is your opposite sign. So Sun semisquare Uranus could be about another person's actions, another person's behavior, perhaps their attitude, and you might be dismayed by another person, or perhaps another person is doing something you just had not expected, and it might put some question marks over your plans. Though there is another aspect to consider, because we've got Sun semisquare Uranus, which I think is a destabilizing influence, but we've also got Venus sextile Saturn. So Venus sextile Saturn is sextile fortunate aspect, Venus planet of relationships. So you might say Venus sextile Saturn represents a relationship that is quite supportive, but yet Sun semisquare Uranus talks about disruption, and it may be about choice. Who is represented by Sun semisquare Uranus, and who's represented by Venus sextile Saturn? So it could be that on Sunday your choices do matter. And again, this is especially the case if you are not a hermit. If you're a hermit, then we perhaps would have to look at it in a different light. But if you are mixing with people, spending time with any one person, some people can be a real problem. They can be a real nightmare. Sun semisquare Uranus, they can just not be reliable. Other people, Venus sextile Saturn, can be completely reliable. And it is possible that the person you know the best is the person who is most likely to let you down. The person who appears to be more serious and responsible may be the person who lets you down. The person, on the other hand, who is light and free and seems to be fairly non-committal, may be the person who surprises to the upside. So this is especially the case on Sunday. So, I don't know what your plans are for Sunday, but there is the possibility on Sunday of surprises. Being surprised by how unreliable one person is, but at the same time being surprised about how completely reliable another person is. So that's a good reason to make your choices, and consider the possibility that some of the outcomes are counterintuitive. You might make a misjudgment. and people can behave in strange ways. So that could be a theme of Sunday in particular. And so what's the best approach? Well, as I said, if you've got something important to do, concentrate on Saturday. Sunday is a day when things are certainly more interesting. There is going to be more excitement, but the question is, do you want there to be more excitement? And it might be that on Sunday you want to play safe and not really do anything, or you don't want to put yourself in a position where you might be let down. Pisces, at the moment you're able to really come over really well. You've got a lot of things to say, and it's not just vague words, just talking for the sake of it. You're able to talk about who you are and what you are, and what you've got to offer, and also what you're working on. And perhaps if you've been quite secretive in the past, now might be a time when you can bring things out into the open, and people will start to understand what kind of person you are. And when people start to understand what kind of person you are, I do think that they will be pleasantly surprised. And looking at Saturday in particular, we have a trine between the moon and the sun. And so moon in Scorpio, trine the sun in Cancer, and this aspect, it does give you a real boost. In fact, you could say you've got the moon in Pisces, not just trine the sun, but it's also trine the North Node. North Node is in Pisces, and so on Saturday, there might be a feeling that things are starting to move, and they're moving your way, and you just have to put a bit of energy in. And it's just important that you're not lazy. You take advantage of this opportunity. And one aspect we have over the weekend is a decile between Jupiter and Uranus. Now, that might sound obscure, Jupiter-Uranus decile, but Jupiter and Uranus are 36 degrees apart, which is 1/10 of the circle. And with that decile, you're able to concentrate on something that is important to you. You have an idea about how things could be. And at first, you might regard it as being hopeless. What is the point? It's a fool's errand. It's just too difficult. Perhaps you should just relax and not bother yourself, not bother anyone else. But there is this possibility that you can take something important to you and you can give it everything you've got. You can give it your heart, your life, your soul. Everything can be put into this, and you can then sort of present yourself with huge power. And you might be surprised at what you're able to change. You might think that people won't change, the environment won't change, but actually, Pisces, you can make it change, and it's because you believe in yourself and you believe that something is possible. And it's not anything vague. It's not like faith. It's that belief that comes from sheer will, and that perhaps you've been put on this planet to do something, or perhaps you've been put on this planet to do something this particular weekend. I mean, we've all got temporary destinies. We think about destiny as one whole lifetime of destiny, but we've got different things that need to be done at different times. And perhaps you need to be thinking about what is your destiny this weekend. And your destiny this weekend is to make sure that you are heard, and really to make sure that really people do notice, because they can notice. And it might be easier, especially with Venus moving into Gemini, to do nothing and just to just enjoy people's company in a vague kind of way. But I think that would be a waste. And right at the end of a weekend, when the moon moves into Sagittarius, the focus does increase. It may not be entirely easy on Sunday. I think that Sunday, for many of us, is going to be quite problematic because of a sun semisquare Uranus. But that sun semisquare Uranus, I don't think it affects you directly. But we've also got the moon moving into Sagittarius, right at the end of the weekend if you're in the Americas, tomorrow on Monday if you're outside the Americas. But when the moon moves into Sagittarius, that's going to give you a further impetus. And those are my forecasts for the 12 signs. And now I want to look at the I Ching. So I asked the question, what is the weekend going to be like for those watching the I Ching section of this video? And the first hexagram I got was hexagram number 46, which is pushing upward. And that sounds good. We want to make progress. We want to move forward, and if we can move forward, that's that's great. And so that might represent our fundamental attitude over the weekend, that we can make progress. We can keep going. There's a feeling of tunneling here with pushing upward. You tunnel under the ground and you're making progress, and then at some stage you need to go above the ground. When I see this hexagram, I always think of those sort of Second World War films, about escaping from prisoner of war camps. You dig down and you have to dig down, and then you make a tunnel that goes under the wire, and then you come up the other side, and then you escape to Switzerland. That's usually how the story works, and of course it often doesn't work out. But the problem with this hexagram is the third line, and the third line from the bottom does move. And what the I Ching says is pushing upwards into an empty city. And that gives us a feeling, going back to the prisoner of war analogy, it's kind of like you think you're moving, you think you're making your tunnel under the wire, but you actually come up right in the middle of the prisoner of war camp. So you perhaps you come up in another cell or something. That's not really what you're trying to achieve. And so there is a danger here of putting a huge amount of energy into something. You think you're moving forward, you think you're making a lot of progress, and actually you're making no progress at all. So that is a danger here. I am not saying that need to happen, and you don't want to be too enthusiastic. And if you find that things are really easy, then that's a possible sign that something's going wrong, that you haven't really thought about it. And so make sure you actually know what you're doing, and don't just rush into a task because you need to find out about it, and it's probably a lot more complicated than you'd realized. And with this moving line, well, it does mean we get to another hexagram, and the hexagram it moves to is hexagram number 7, which is the army. And the army is it's a complicated hexagram. I won't say complicated hexagram. It's just it's a hexagram that can sometimes be difficult to make sense of in a sort of an ordinary way. We're talking about the weekend, the army. I mean, it's not like literally the army is going to move into your living space, and you have to kind of look at it symbolically. And it just could be that if you are trying to make progress, you can't necessarily do it on your own. And perhaps that's what happens when you realize that you have made no progress, or that you've made limited progress. You thought you were doing well and you haven't done so well, and you actually realize you need some help, and you need to perhaps become part of something larger than yourself. So I'd like to be have been more positive about this weekend, and it's just a reading for 2 days, but there is just this danger that you don't think things through. And if you really want to get results over the weekend, you're going to need a lot of planning, and you should really watch out when a task gets too easy, because if it gets too easy, then that's a sure sign that you haven't read the instructions, that you haven't fully understood what you're getting yourself into, and at a later stage, perhaps when you put more effort in, you'll realize that maybe you've been wasting your time. But it needn't happen. I'm just providing a warning here. And so, turning to the astrology, or turning back to the astrology, this weekend, right at the end of a weekend, Neptune goes stationary retrograde, and I'm sure a lot of people are excited about this. It's a big event. And here is the chart for Neptune going retrograde. This is the moment Neptune goes retrograde. So, in fact, it was on Friday, July the 4th, 2025 at 10:35 p.m. London time. But I wanted to talk about something else in my video for Friday. I wanted to talk, for example, about Venus-Uranus conjunction. So here is that moment. So, what does it mean? Astrologers do get excited about it. So remember, from a heliocentric perspective, planets never go retrograde. It's only from the Earth's perspective that they appear to go retrograde. And Neptune, when it goes retrograde, it really highlights one part of the zodiac. 2 degrees 11 Aries. That's the moment. That's the point. It is. I know that. It's just got an R there. So that R on the chart means that it means it has gone retrograde. A few minutes earlier, and that R would not be there, or even a minute earlier, that the R would not be there. And so, in order to understand what it means for Neptune to go retrograde on an individual basis, one has to think about, what is Neptune? I mean, Neptune is an outer planet, and if you are just an individual, it might not have any impact at all. I mean, that is absolutely possible. Now, if, for example, you have a personal point in your chart at 2 degrees of a cardinal sign. So let's say you've got your Venus at 2 degrees Aries, then you're probably going to feel that Neptune stationary retrograde in quite a major way. Or if you've got Venus at 2 degrees Cancer, or some other personal planet there. Now, there's always a house that it's in, so you might want to ask, what house it's in, or so for example, if you've got Taurus rising and your Neptune is in Aries, then there's going to be a sort of 12th house feel to that, because Aries is in the sign before that from a whole sign perspective, and so that might say something about your dreams, and so that could be the way you want to see it. But to be honest, on a personal basis, you can probably, in most cases, ignore the fact that Neptune is going retrograde. It's not necessarily such an important event. I know a lot of people are going to disagree with me, but I don't think it's something we absolutely have to consider. Though again, it does represent the freezing of a point in the zodiac, 2 degrees 11, and we have to look at the overall picture. So here is that moment, and of course it goes retrograde very close to Saturn. It's 18 arc minutes away from Saturn, and over the next couple of weeks, Saturn and Neptune will get closer and closer together. So I don't think you can actually see this retrograde motion in isolation. you have to be aware that Saturn is about to go retrograde, and Saturn is about to go retrograde very close to Neptune. So we should perhaps see this as being a Saturn-Neptune event. And I'll probably be talking about this in much greater detail later on. But when you've got Saturn and Neptune coming together, it is about fear. And I think that this is what this retrograde motion is going to be about. Worried about things. Yeah, Neptune in Aries might be about leadership, fantasies about leadership, but Neptune is perhaps going retrograde. So you could say that at the moment, a lot of people are thinking about leaders, whether it's Trump, but Aries kind of leaders like Trump, or if you're in the UK, that would be sort of Nigel Farage. Of course, Nigel Farage is not the Prime Minister, but he's an Aries. He's getting a lot of attention. Perhaps Neptune moving into Aries has actually helped Nigel Farage, and with Neptune moving retrograde in Aries, perhaps people will have questions about great leaders, or supposedly great leaders, people who seem to sort of answer questions, but there is still that demand for charismatic politicians with Neptune in Aries, and that's going to be a feature of Neptune in Aries. Remember, Neptune is moving through Aries on and off until the late 2030s. But short term, there might be some questions, and we have to think about Neptune's overall cycle. Okay, it's now retrograde, and it will go back into Pisces. So when does Neptune go back into Pisces? Neptune will go back into Pisces in the autumn. I make it that it goes back into Pisces on, when does it go back into Pisces? The end of October, something like the 23rd of October. And so it doesn't return to Aries until the end of January. So that's maybe what we need to be thinking about. Between now and the end of January, what is going to change? How are concepts of leadership going to change? So that's one possibility. And more immediately, I must emphasize, Saturn conjunct Neptune is about fear. We are worried. People are worried. Where is this whole thing going? And that may say something about the experience of being on this planet right now. And I don't think that it's necessarily especially personal. And for the moment, that's all I want to say about Neptune in Neptune retrograde. I will be returning to the topic because I need to look at Saturn and Neptune together, because we're getting really close to an exact Saturn-Neptune conjunction. Again, the conjunction doesn't become exact, but it's close enough. And so now I want to look at something else, and that is Venus in Gemini. And Venus in Gemini, here it is over the weekend. I haven't got a chart for the moment it entered Gemini. Again, Venus, it moved into Gemini on Friday, so I'm kind of talking about in this video something that has already happened. But here, the weekend chart, there's Venus at 1 degree 41 Gemini, and Venus does stay in Gemini until I think the end of July. Yeah, so 30th, 31st. I think on the 30th, 31st of July, Venus moves into Cancer. So yeah, we always have to look at things in terms of the rest of the chart. So if we look at Venus and Gemini theoretically, then Venus could be about how we relate. It's about maybe about relationships, and Venus in Gemini is looking for variety, and it's not just about romantic relationships. It's also about just connections in general, and it is possible, all things being equal, that affections can change. Maybe someone with Venus in Gemini, they appear to show loyalty, and then circumstances change, and Venus in Gemini, just has to move on to something else. although that's not always going to be the case. And you have to look at the rest of the chart. Venus in Gemini. Venus is a planet of the arts and what we're trying to create. It's about beauty. And so Venus in Gemini might have eclectic tastes, not being just satisfied with one thing. Venus in Gemini is very different from Venus in Taurus. Venus in Taurus might regard one thing in particular as being beautiful. Venus in Taurus might want to indulge itself in particular ways. Most Taurians have one particular indulgence. Of course, if you've got Venus in Gemini, you may have different views, and you may like one thing at one moment, but then you might want to switch. So there is a flexibility to Venus in Gemini which simply isn't there with Venus in Taurus. All things being equal, and it's just so difficult to look at a planetary placement in isolation. And Venus in Gemini, on a sort of a less pleasant note, it could be cold compared, say, for example, with Venus in Cancer. So Venus in Cancer, you think it might be sort of warm and sort of sentimental, but Venus in Gemini might be rather different. Venus in Gemini, might be very pleasant one moment if you've got their attention, but then they might start thinking about something else, and they might want to cut something off. And Geminis are very good at that. Just deciding that they got bored of something, and it may not be a person, may be an activity, it may be even a form of art. Someone might be really into one type of art, one type of creative expression, and then suddenly it all comes to an end. And so that's a way it can work. And one word that you might think about with Venus and Gemini could be fickle. Fickle in their affections. So that's certainly a possible manifestation. So what I want to do now is move from the sort of the theoretical to, if you like, the statistical, and just look at a few people. No, it's not really statistics. You're never going to prove astrology works with statistics, and even if it were to be statistics, the sample I'm going to show you is completely biased. So biased in terms of my interests. So these are a few people with Venus in Gemini, and I'm going to start with a murderer and her victim, both who have Venus in Gemini. So this was a case that was really big. I don't know, was it 10? I forget when it happened. It was well over 10 years ago. But there was this woman called Jodi Arias, and she killed her boyfriend. I mean, her boyfriend, I think, got bored of her or wasn't interested anymore. But she was completely obsessed with him, and she tracked him down and killed him. And it was a huge story, and she's now serving a life sentence. I think she was pretty close to getting the death penalty, and she has Venus. She has Venus in Gemini, and there is Venus in Gemini. Now, the question is, do you really associate Venus and Gemini with obsession? Absolutely not. And maybe you have to look at what else is going on in the chart. I mean, Venus opposition Neptune and square Saturn. Now, so Venus opposition Neptune and square Saturn. Again, I don't think the sign is especially important here, but this could be someone who had a fantasy. And your Venus square Saturn is, of course, about being feeling that rejected, and at the same time, Venus or opposition Neptune might believe that something is made in heaven, is meant to last forever. But perhaps what is more important is not her Venus in Gemini, but the Venus in Gemini of her victim. So her boyfriend, who she killed, Travis Alexander, he had Venus in Gemini. Now that Venus in Gemini is projectable, and I don't want to sort of talk about the synastry between the two in detail. But so if in a male chart, Venus in Gemini, your Venus may say what you might get attracted to in the opposite sex. So if he's got Venus in Gemini conjunct Jupiter, he might be attracted to a Venus-Jupiter kind of woman, a woman who is rather over the top. And so although that Venus-Jupiter sounds very fortunate, it sounds as if this man should be lucky, you have to kind of break it down. And Venus conjunct Jupiter just may be, in terms of relationships, a crazy woman, or a woman who is really excessive. And of course, he's got Venus in Gemini. Someone with Venus in Gemini can be quite fickle in his affection. So he might hitch up with a woman one day, and at a later stage decide that he's had enough and he wants to move on. And that can be how Venus in Gemini works. But because the woman he eventually linked up with, Jodie Arias, also had Venus in Gemini. That was the attraction, and so she represented that Venus, and she represented that Venus conjunct Jupiter. That's a way in which Venus in Gemini could work, and it's not just about Venus in Gemini. It's about the aspects. So another murderess who had Venus in Gemini was Mara Hindley. So Mara Hindley, if you're in the UK, she is the most notorious woman in British sort of criminal history. She was responsible with her boyfriend Ian Brady for killing children in the mid 1960s, the Moors murders. And she had Venus in Gemini. She had Venus at 29 degrees 44 Gemini. And this might represent the callousness of Gemini. And she actually has a semisextile. She has Venus semisextile Sun in Cancer. So her Sun was on the verge of moving into Leo, and Venus was on the verge of moving into Cancer, and her Venus was square Neptune. So Venus in Gemini might be looking for something different. And of course her boyfriend Ian Brady was kind of unusual. I think he was sort of obsessed with Nazism and German stuff, and he would also had this sort of part of Ian Brady. He was a Capricorn, but maybe he kind of piqued her interest, and then then he had some responsibility for what she did. I think that if she hadn't have met Ian Brady, she would have never killed anyone. I think, and so. This is a reminder that Venus in Gemini can be problematic, and you do need to look at other things going on in the chart, and you might also find it important that Venus is in the last degree of Gemini, the anaretic degree. So this can be a degree where a planet just doesn't fully function. I'm not convinced entirely by the anaretic degree, or at least by a planet being in the last degree, but this would certainly be an example of Venus kind of malfunctioning. Now, if you have got Venus in Gemini, there can be a lightness to you, and you can trivialize things, and you can just say things. And Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny had Venus in Gemini, and he also had the Sun in Gemini. And Geminis, can be the trickster. They like to make fun of things. And of course, Alexei Navalny made fun of Vladimir Putin by having a film about Vladimir Putin's sort of mansion, and talking about all the rooms and the opulence of it, and being, he just felt he could, get away with it. Venus in Gemini, Venus in Gemini. particularly if it's Sun in Gemini as well. He's got lots of things to say, and his words, in his case, got him into trouble. And it may also be important that Venus is conjunct the Sun. He had a Venus is combust, so the Sun, it may not be about what the Sun is ruling. It just may be that the Sun, it represents a powerful figure, maybe even the power of the state that in the end destroyed him. But Venus in Gemini needs to be careful and perhaps underestimates what else is going on. Notice how his Venus is opposition Neptune, and Venus is about aesthetics and how he presents himself, and perhaps it's about his sense of humor and what he feels he can get away with. And obviously he didn't get away with it. And Venus in Gemini can have good social skills. Certainly Navalny was popular amongst a group in Russia. I don't think Navalny was anything like as popular as some people in the West thought. I think he was more fringe than people were thinking about him as an alternative leader to Vladimir Putin. I think that was an exaggeration, but still, people in the West seem to like him, and his likeness was shared by Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson, former British Prime Minister, has Venus in Gemini. I think he very much shows Venus in Gemini. It's very difficult to know with Boris Johnson, what part of Gemini are we actually seeing, because Boris Johnson had 4 planets in Gemini, and so it's difficult to isolate that. Venus in Gemini may say something about relationships, and Boris Johnson has had quite a few relationships. He's been sort of all over the place, and there was a time when people had lost count of the number of children he had. Some people were saying he didn't even know how many children he had himself. I don't think that's obviously an exaggeration, but his Venus in Gemini conjunct the Sun. Now, Sun conjunct Venus in Gemini, there could be a coldness there. And remember, he's also got Moon in Scorpio. There is a coldness. He comes over as being this sort of bumbling, nice person, certainly a very effective political campaigner. But there's definitely a darkness to Boris Johnson. And Sun Venus, people have their purposes. Sun Venus can treat people. Sun Venus in Gemini might just treat people as objects. Venus in Gemini can arguably treat people as objects. People have their purpose and then they outlive them, and that may say something also about how he treats women. I don't know precisely how he treats women, but with his sort of multiple relationships and children, with all his children he's had, with various mothers. I'm not quite sure. I don't know about the details of his various relationships. So that could be how Venus works, but it is potentially very very sociable, and that is how Venus and Gemini can work. And I wonder, someone who's got Venus and Gemini, I have no idea how this works, but Brian Thompson, remember, he was the CEO of United Healthcare, who was gunned down in New York. He had Venus in Gemini square Jupiter in Pisces. Now this might be something completely different. Venus square Jupiter. Venus could be about money. And Venus square Jupiter could be about the acquisition of money. And he was a very rich man, Brian Thompson, even though he didn't found United Healthcare. I think I read some of it. He had a fortune of tens of millions of dollars as someone who was just a CEO of a company he didn't found. That seems to be a lot of money. But Venus square Jupiter could say something about him, but obviously his assassination or his killing led to United Healthcare getting a lot of bad press, and this may say something about him and him taking things too far. But I'm speculating because I don't really know anything about Brian Thompson, except he was very rich. He was CEO of United Healthcare, and he got gunned down. And we don't know who killed him. There is a suspect who is on trial. I think maybe on trial for his life, but we don't know if he did it. So that's Brian Thompson. And Elon has Venus in Gemini, and Elon has Venus in Gemini trine Mars. And as far as relationships and children, there's actually we just talked about Boris Johnson, and sort of Elon Musk has loads of children, and Venus in Gemini may find it, someone with Venus in Gemini might find it difficult to be faithful to one person for too long. Things change. That's Venus in Gemini. Things move from one thing to another. And Julian Assange also has Venus in Gemini, because remember, Julian Assange was born 5 days after Elon Musk, and so he has the same Venus trine Mars that Elon Musk has. That may say something about his relationships. We shouldn't forget that all of this drama about him being in prison, and it all started because of the Swedes. I think it was Sweden wanted his extradition for some alleged crime of a sexual nature. But I already talked about Julian Assange quite recently, so I'll move on. And as far as politics are concerned, British politics, Jeremy Corbyn, former leader of the Labour Party, has got Venus in Gemini. And Venus in Gemini might indicate his independent mindedness. He has just announced that he's setting up a new political party, and he has, with his Venus in Gemini, Venus conjunct Mercury, he just doesn't follow the accepted norms. If you're a politician, very often you're just supposed to do what you're told. You follow party policy, you don't rock the boat, and that way you've got some possibility of getting sort of ministerial position. Of course, in his case, with his Gemini planets, he was able to get a lot of support in the Labour Party for his leadership bid in the last decade. I can't remember when that was. Was it 2015, 2016? I can't remember the precise date. And his independent mindedness and his championing of what he would see as genuine socialist causes, and not to mention Palestine, certainly got him attention. But the independent mindedness, I think, is or can be part of not just being someone with Venus in Gemini, but also having a lot of planets in Gemini. So perhaps with Jeremy Corbyn's Venus in Gemini, it's difficult to isolate which of those planets really matters. And continuing on a theme of independence, again, if you're into British politics, there's an independent Labour member of Parliament. Was a Labour member of Parliament by the name of Rosie Duffield, and she left the Labour Party. She was elected as a Labour member of Parliament at the last year, and she quite quickly left the party because of an argument about trans issues. She took the view that women are women and took an independent view, and of course got vilified for it. And she has Venus in Gemini, so maybe Venus in Gemini has an ability to be different. And it's kind of interesting that Elon Musk was born on June the 28th, 1971, and Julian Assange was born on July the 3rd, 1971, and Rosie Duffield was born just a few days after Elon Musk was born on July the 1st, 1971. And so she has got this Venus-Mars trine, and Venus-Mars trine in her issue, it could be taking a stand for women, as she would see it. I think she might have had other reasons to disagree with the Labour Party, but taking a stand for women and getting a lot of being bullied by those sort of supporting trans rights. Being bullied in quite a sort of serious way. So much so that she left the Labour Party, and so that might be how Venus in Gemini works. And once Venus in Gemini decides to take a stand and decides to be different, it might seem to be disloyalty to some, but it's just independent-mindedness. So this could be a positive aspect of Venus being in Gemini. And by the way, in Germany, in one of the sort of independent, smaller parties, Sarah Wagenknecht party, and Sarah Wagenknecht has her own sort of left-wing party, and Sarah Wagenknecht has Venus in Gemini. So there is an independent-mindedness to Venus, and of course to Venus in Gemini. And remember, with Rosie Duffield, Venus in Gemini is not going to be projected. It might actually say something about who she is, not projected onto someone else. A woman with a woman will keep her female planets, and likewise with Sarah Wagenknecht. So those are a few thoughts about Venus in Gemini. I think it may actually matter with Venus in Gemini what the gender is. It's absolutely possible that a man with Venus in Gemini experiences it very differently than a woman, because a woman with Venus in Gemini, she's not going to project it. It might be the real her, who she really is. So anyway, those are a few thoughts on Venus in Gemini. I hope you found that of some interest. If you enjoyed this video, I'd be very grateful if you were to like it. If you're not subscribed, I'd be super grateful if you were to subscribe. If you want to buy me a coffee, there's a link in the description, and I will talk to you again very soon.